Hello, well, it's Tuesday and it is an absolutely beautiful day here in Wellington. We're in recess this week, which means that Parliament doesn't sit for the normal sort of question and answer time and normal business. You probably know this, but we sit roughly about 31, 32 weeks a year. But in terms of the executive, that's the cabinet, we pretty much meet every week, so we have a cabinet every Monday morning. Typically those cabinets start at about 11 o'clock in the morning, finish around about sort of 2:30, and we have a series of agenda items that we work our way through. For me on a Monday, after that I do a post-cabinet press conference around about 4 o'clock, and that's sort of 45 minutes where the journalists ask me questions on a wide range of issues, things that we might have discussed at cabinet but also wider issues. So yesterday we talked a bit about housing and housing affordability. It's a very tricky subject really. It's not new and it's not unique to New Zealand. The previous government commissioned a lot of work on housing affordability. You remember back in about sort of 2006, 2007, we had a very hot housing market, and that was locking a lot of people out of the opportunity to buy a home. They did a huge amount of work, really probably didn't get very far, to be perfectly honest, despite all of the recommendations that they came up with. So as a starting point, the single biggest determining factor about whether people can afford to buy a home generally is interest rates. And that's because most people borrow the bulk of funds that they use to acquire a home. So they save a deposit, but then they go and borrow from the bank, and that's called the loan to value ratio. And typically the banks like to lend around about 70% of the house to you, but it's not impossible that they'll lend 80 or 90 or sometimes even 100%. In fact, when the boom was really going on in about 2006, 2007, we saw banks lending more than the entire price of the house so that people could effectively buy furnishings and things for it. So we've got interest rates now on very low levels, and you'll hear people sometimes talking about the old 3% loans that were around many, many years ago. In fact, you or your parents may well have bought a house through that sort of mechanism. I mean, truthfully, interest rates are very low at the moment, so you can go to the bank and probably borrow short-term money under 5%. So we're at those fairly low levels anyway. So the government's view is this is largely a supply issue. Is there enough housing coming on stream fast enough? Can developers, develop brownfield sites, which are existing sites where they may maybe bowl in some existing building that's there or some other housing that's there to develop more intensified housing, and that's a big issue in a place like Auckland. It's also a problem because it's not solely the central government's issue, it's actually largely local government. And then sitting within that is the interaction of building companies, investors, whether developers can actually get finance for their projects. And then if you take a country like Australia, you look at that, they have some real differences. For instance, the bulk of their housing, residential housing, is built by three big companies, and they tend to build a far more standardised home. So in New Zealand, we're a bit more bespoke. We like to build different things for different people, and that obviously costs more. So the government's really essentially saying we're going to do a few things: speed up the release of land, so that's sort of greenfield sites, if you like, so that's paddocks that are around the edge of a city, and that's often deemed the metropolitan urban limit. So essentially expanding that out. That will also mean building more infrastructure to support that new and sprawling development of a city. Second thing is to really speed up the development of those brownfield sites. And one thing that we're proposing to is make some changes to the Resource Management Act, which amongst other things would say for a medium-sized development, that's probably 20 houses or less, that a council would have to give a yes or no decision on the resource consent within 6 months or less. That's very much like the provision we've got for national infrastructure, which is a decision within 9 months or less. So that's the sort of thing we're looking at there. There are many other sorts of things that we're considering, and as I say, there's a lot of work that we've been doing in areas like for instance, regulation of builders and all of those sort of bureaucratic type issues, which again weigh on the cost of housing. We're also looking at development contributions. That's the amount that a council will charge on top of the raw land for your development of a section. So there's a lot in there. I think we're not promising that house prices are going to fall on the back of what we're doing. In fact, most people wouldn't want us to do that because that would undermine their core asset. But what is important is that we don't get rapidly rising house prices because in the end, all that encourages people to do is to feel wealthier, borrow more money from the bank and get the credit sort of boom and bust that we had back in sort of 2006, 2007. So it's a finely balanced, delicate sort of issue. One thing that you'll hear a lot from the Greens and Labor about is a capital gains tax. So their argument will be, if you put a capital gains tax on, it will stop prices, house prices rising rapidly. In fact, there's no evidence to support that. Most OECD countries that have a capital gains tax, in fact, had fast rising house prices as we did in that 2006-7 period. 3/4 of all housing is excluded from a capital gains tax proposed by Labor and the Greens. In fact, what it would encourage people to do is overinvest in their family home, because that wouldn't be subject to a capital gains tax, and underinvest in other forms of property. If they move out of the rental market, that might in fact cause a scarcity of rental properties, so it may in fact be harder for those who choose to rent, of which about 30% of New Zealanders choose to rent a property at some point for a particular reason. This government also made changes to the taxation system in relation to housing, particularly that investor category of housing, that yielded quite a lot of cash for us, nearly $1 billion. So we've made substantial changes. So the tax changes we've made, we believe, are the right one. The Labor and Greens party are also arguing that their capital gains tax not only would apply to this portion of housing, which is an investor portion, but they're also arguing it would apply to every single business in the country. So every business, large or small, would then pay a capital gains tax. Every business would have to be valued at a point in time. And what happens with capital gains tax is they're called a realisation tax. So you only pay them when you sell the asset. And so one of the things, again, we've seen around the world is huge amount of efforts made by people not to sell properties or not to sell businesses, which in the end leads these countries to having to introduce gifting duty and death duties, all of the sorts of things that we got rid of. If you want all of those things, in other words, aka a lot more taxes, then Russell Norman could be your man. He's there in the weekend telling us he wants to be the finance minister in the next government with Labor. This is also the person that wants to print money. And if you're interested to see how that works, stay there for just 1 second. Yes, I have here something you might find reasonably interesting. This is a $100 billion Zimbabwean note. When it was printed in July 2008, for $100 billion, you got a bumper box of Kentucky Fried Chicken and 2 bottles of Coke. Or if you're interested in something just a little bit smaller for your wallet, this is a $500 million note that Russell Norman wants to print for New Zealand. That was issued in May of 2008. You needed 100 of these to buy an egg. So I think the egg is Russell Norman if he thinks printing money is the right way to go. If you're interested in monetary policy, the new incoming Governor of the Reserve Bank, Graham Wheeler, gave quite an interesting speech last week, basically debunked all the theories that Labor and the Greens are talking about. The most top of the list was printing money, the other was trying to get the exchange rate down by intervening. Have a read of the speech, you'll enjoy it.